Coming to you from the city that imposes a $25 fine for flirting, it's Ventriloquism Weekly. Hey everyone, Matt Bailey back with you on this Monday. What a thrill it is to have Joe Selph with us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Joe Selph, he is a puppeteer who worked for many years with the Muppets before moving on to work with legendary artist Rene. Rene, of course, one name for Rene Zendejas, is known for his masterful marionette creations and performances. Our discussion starts out covering Joe Selph's incredible life in show business and turns into a moving tribute to his late performing partner. Here now, our interview with Joe Selph. Joe Selph, welcome to Ventriloquism Weekly. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing great, Matt. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. This is going to just be an awesome time. I want to start off, begin at the beginning, as I always do. How did you get into puppetry?
Oh, goodness. I first got really into puppetry as a very young child, and it started as a trip home from a very traumatizing visit to the dentist. And on the way home, my parents took me and said, hey, we're going to go to the toy store, buy yourself a toy. And, of course, that made me happy. And we went there, and I found something that was called a showboat theater. And it was just a small plastic showboat, like the kind you would see that used to go up and down the rivers of the South, like the Delta Queen. And it housed a small theater, and it came with all of these little characters on stands and scripts and set pieces and everything. And so I went home and started acting out shows in it. It came with Cinderella and Heidi and things like that. And so I would set it up in the door of a hallway and tack up sheets and towels around it and set up lights and things and make that my show. And at that point I realized, wow, I kind of like this performing thing, because you have to keep in mind, believe it or not, I was quite the shy child. And then not too long after that, I was in Nashville, because I grew up in the Tennessee area.
Oh, cool.
And there was a new mall that opened. You know, malls were a big thing. You know, this was back in the old days, Sonny.
Yeah.
So went to this mall, and in this store, they had something called Pelham Marionettes.
Ooh.
And Pelhams were made over in the UK, and they were really, really popular as toys for children. Because they were very easy to use and very easy to untangle. And so I got my first Pelham marionette there. And I started collecting those, getting them as gifts for birthdays and Christmas, things like that. And that sort of prompted me to want to kind of put together a show, I guess you would say.
Yeah. Why? I'm always fascinated because I ask this when it's ventriloquist. I ask why ventriloquism. I often wonder why marionettes.
Well, and I don't know if I have a good answer for that, other than I was just really struck by these Pelham marionettes. Mm-hmm. And, I had seen marionettes on television. I was familiar with puppets on television. And they just struck me by they were so beautiful. They were very colorful. And, while Bob Pelham passed away and the original Pelham puppets are no longer made, mm-hmm. They are still out there and available. And, I've managed to amass quite the collection of them, including replicating my original group of marionettes. But I think what that did for me was sort of kind of instill this spark of like, wow, I like to perform for people. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of what sparked it. I think it was just a fluke that it ended up being a marionette.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Is it unfair? I guess the second part to that question is it unfair to say that marionettes are harder than any other form of puppetry?
Well, I think on the surface, people would say, yes, they are harder because you're looking at a character that's hanging on a bunch of strings. And I often liken it to a harpist. When a harpist is playing music, you can't think about where the strings are on that harp. You have to instinctively know where they are. So once you've mastered that, it's really no different than any of the other puppetry-related art forms, whether you're, operating a hand puppet like you would see on Sesame Street, or whether you're, operating a ventriloquist figure. You've got to know instinctively where all those control levers are inside that body, because you need to focus on your performance and not on the actual mechanics of it. The same thing can go for a rod puppet or a shadow puppet. And in some ways, for me, I think manipulating puppets that don't speak or don't sing are oftentimes harder than those that do. So I don't know that a marionette's any harder. It's just a different skill set that you have to master.
Yeah, and it's. I was harping on the. No pun intended. But I was harping on the marionettes at the top. But you do have a connection in ventriloquism, a connection to Colonel Bill Bowie.
Oh, absolutely. So I grew up north of Nashville in a town called Clarksville, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And when I first started showing my interest in puppetry, I ended up putting together a puppet show for our local mall for the 4th of July. I was a whopping 12 years old at the time. Cool. And I went and the mall agreed to hire me to do this show that I wrote called The Witch Who Hated the 4th of July. And, of course, this was, around 4th of July at the mall. And while I was at the mall performing, there was a local businessman there in town that approached me and saw the puppet show and came up and started talking with me afterwards. And it turns out that he also had a connection to the Puppeteers of America, a very well-known organization here in the United States and abroad, and sort of took me under his wing. And we started talking, and by this point, I had, as a gift, an old plastic Charlie McCarthy vent figure. Mm-hmm. One of the ones that you could just, buy at any toy store back at the time or toy section. And, I was playing around with it. I wasn't real seriously into it. But he knew I had an interest. And he said, well, by the way, there's a very well-known ventriloquist that lives not far from you in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Hopkinsville was maybe 20 miles from where I live. And so he connected me with this gentleman by phone, and then my dad, I remember him driving me to this guy's house, and it was Colonel Bill Bowie. Mm-hmm. And that started a many years long relationship with him, where I would often go up like on a Saturday morning and spend the entire day with him at his home.
Did you ever?
And go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. We had on the show a couple weeks ago, we had a gentleman by the name of Steve Kilgore. Mm-hmm. Did you ever run into him? Because I know both of you guys from the Nashville area. Just really out of curiosity, because I know a lot of people would end up going up to Bill's house.
Yeah, no, not at the time. I didn't. I was the only person really at the time I knew that was interested in ventriloquism, and Bill was just more than happy to have me come out to his place and just hang out. And of course, I was pretty young at this point. I was still kind of a tween or young teen, I guess you would say, and didn't really know sort of the breadth of his work, but just how much I enjoyed him and seeing his performances. So at that time, I decided to buy my first, I guess you would call it, professional vent figure, which Bill Bowie made. And I started using him to perform. First thing I did was a talent show at school, and then went on to just perform in the community, and did a big talent show in Nashville and won that and got in the Nashville newspaper. And I did ventriloquism for quite a few years while also performing the marionettes as well.
And that led, if I'm not mistaken, in the things we were talking about before, to magic and clowning.
It did. So, naturally, once I sort of broke through the shyness barrier, I guess you would say, and started learning more about those performing arts. I wanted to get into magic. And of course, there were a lot of companies you could order catalogs and buy things. We didn't have any magic stores in that area. So I got a few things that way, and then also was interested in kind of dabbling in clowning as well. So, I was just trying to explore all of those performing arts at that age. And it was through the gentleman that I'd met locally that I started getting involved with the Puppeteers of America as well, and attending their conventions, which just, for someone my age and seeing these performers from all around the world, I was just in awe. And I knew at that point, that's what I want to do.
And you're with Puppeteers of America. You would work with this gentleman later, and you ran into him at a convention, and I don't want to say because it's just weird how these things happen. I don't know the story. You need to tell it. You know where I'm going. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. So at the time, I believe I was 13, if I'm not mistaken. And the Puppeteers of America had their annual festival in Nashville, Tennessee. They always hold their festivals at a college or a university campus. You can stay on site in the dorm rooms, and of course all of the performances and workshops are there. Now, I didn't need to stay at the university because it was only 45 minutes away. And
what university was it? Just out of curiosity.
I'm drawing a blank. I do not remember. But this was about probably early 70s. I know that. So we would drive down for the day. And I had made myself kind of a crude hand puppet. And one of the workshops that I went to was on how to manipulate your hand puppet. And so I went to that workshop. It was lunchtime. I was out sitting in the quad on a bench. And I had this puppet out, and I was, manipulating it and practicing. And a gentleman came and asked if he could sit down next to me. I'm like, oh, absolutely. And, he said, oh, what's your name? I said, Joe. He goes, I'm Jim. And, did you make this puppet? I said, yes, I did. And I've been trying to figure out how to make it come alive. And he goes, well, let me give you some pointers. And so he showed me a few things. Then he goes, well, would you like to see a puppet that I made? And I'm like, sure. Opens up a briefcase and slips Kermit the Frog on my hand. And at that point, I realized that was Jim Henson.
Oh, my gosh. That...
I was in shock.
Wow.
Absolute shock.
And he put Kermit on your... What? Please, take me through the emotions.
Well, first and foremost was shock.
Yeah.
I knew immediately who that character was, but, I never knew what Jim Henson looked like. It's one of the, I guess you can say, the beauties of being a puppeteer for film or television. Everyone knows your name, but no one knows what you look like. So, because you always perform through your characters. I was just giddy. And through the rest of that week, I ran into him many, many times. And at one point, I told him, I said, I want to come work for you. And he goes, well, when you get older, you let me know when you want to come work for me. And so that was that. And that was the last time that I saw him until many years later.
Yeah, and you did later work with him.
I did. I eventually left Tennessee and moved out to the West Coast, first up to the San Francisco Bay Area, and then moved down to the Los Angeles area. And because of my connection with the Puppeteers of America, a very good friend of mine that lived in Los Angeles, she contacted me and said, hey, Joe, Jim Henson is opening a West Coast headquarters, and they're going to be looking for puppeteers. And I was excited, and I told her the story, and I said, he's not going to remember me. She goes, well, here, let me get you, his contact information. Send him a letter. I bet he will remember you. Well, sure enough, he did.
Wow.
And invited me down to go to was sort of like an open call audition. Now, mind you, at this point, I had not been performing for a few years. I really had no clue at all whatsoever how to operate a hand puppet to the degree that the Muppets were performed.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed up to this massive kind of open call audition, and they would bring us in small groups. There were puppets, there were mirrors, there were people. They had us performing a little bit on a camera and whatnot, and then that was it. And they said they would let us know what the next step was. Well, I got a phone call that said that they wanted to bring me back and kind of a callback audition, but that the audition could last as long as 2 weeks. I'm thinking, 2 weeks, okay. So I showed up the first day, and there were, if I remember correctly, probably at least 30 of us there. And they said, here's how it's going to work. We're going to put you guys through all these exercises every day. And when you leave every day at a certain time, we're going to call you and let you know if we want you to come back the next day. And so this happened, and every night I waited anxiously by the phone. Every day I got called back, and there were fewer and fewer people there until it was down to about this core group of 10 of us. And at that point, they spent the last week just training us on the Muppet technique of performing, and the rest was history. I started, working on various projects for them. At the time, Jim Henson was still alive. The very first project that I got hired to work on was called Muppet Vision 3D. It was going into Walt Disney World.
Yeah, I saw it when we went down there, yeah.
And very excited to be working on that. And, of course, all of us being new, we did background characters, so whether it was a small world character or a marching band member or whatever it was. So, we weren't working the core characters because all of his core Muppeteers were there. And we were on one of the last days of the shoot filming the finale, which is where Miss Piggy plays the Statue of Liberty, and Sam Eagle's going to have his big finale, and they've got the Penguin Orchestra below. And, of course, at the time, Frank Oz was the voice and performer of Miss Piggy, but he was off working on something else at the time, and Steve Whitmire, who's now known for being Kermit, was pulled in to operate Miss Piggy just for this big finale scene. And Jim came out and he goes, and I need someone to work with Steve on Miss Piggy. And looks over, he goes, Joe, how about you? Now, you remember that feeling I had the day he slipped, Kermit on my hand. Yeah. I suddenly had this same feeling, and I'm like, okay. And so here's Steve Whitmire and I climbing up on this big, tall, ladder and up to where Miss Piggy was. And I was Miss Piggy's right hand, as they called, when she dropped the torch out of her hand and it fell down into the orchestra of penguins and caught all the fireworks on fire prematurely. And, and that was just one of the best days ever.
That's incredible. That's incredible. How'd you go from working with Jim Henson Company to meeting Rene? I think you said you didn't initially work with him.
No, I didn't. Of course, as I mentioned, I was very involved with the Puppeteers of America, and they started having local regional festivals, and they were going to have a festival in San Diego one year, and this was in the early 90s. And I was in charge of this special raffle they would always have at their festivals that helped to raise money for their board of trustees to be able to travel around to the different festivals and attend meetings and whatnot. And so someone had arranged for a donation from Rene, and they said, hey, you live near him. Would you go pick it up? So I called him, drove over to his shop in Burbank, have no clue who this man is. And he greeted me and welcomed me inside. And all of a sudden, here I am in this fantastic studio, this workshop just full of puppets. Mm-hmm. But I still had no clue at the time really who he was.
Yeah.
And when it came time to pick up the article that he had donated, I suddenly realized who he was as he handed me one of the original Pillsbury Doughboys that he had created for Mark Wilson and Nani Darnell's 1970s magic television show called The Magic Circus. Mm-hmm. I was a huge fan of that show, being a budding magician at the time. And so that, of course, with Rene, everything's about stories. And, so he had to tell me the story of how he was working with them. And I was just in awe. And so when it was time for me to leave, he's like, hey, come by anytime. So that Pillsbury Doughboy got raffled off. The person that won it still lives in San Diego, by the way. But it prompted me to call Rene again. And we started this friendship and really clicked. And he wanted to know more about my background. And I mentioned how I had started in Marionette. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, I could use someone to help me do some Marionette shows because I'm, always busy building or whatever. And you could take my shows out locally for birthday parties or whatever. And I was excited. Sure. Absolutely. So about I guess that was a good 6 months or so after I met him, I started working for him. And then a couple of years later, as I was, working with him to kind of change up his shows and things, I'm like, well, why don't you perform anymore? And he goes, well, I do, but, it's a one-person show. And I said, well, let's make it a two-person show. Why not?
Yeah.
And that's when he and I started working together. And this was, I think by this point, probably 1995. And we worked together from that point on and just made his what used to be a single-person show into a double-person show.
I hate to pull this down into a really somber note, but this curiosity stems from getting to see the two of you masters work at CAX last year in January 2014. And since then, of course, those that don't know, Rene has unfortunately passed away. When was the last time you two performed that double act together?
Well, he went into the hospital right around his birthday. It was his 87th birthday, which was the end of September of 2014. And we actually had just performed a show 2 weeks prior to that together out in Redlands, California for a mutual friend. Mm-hmm. And so he was in perfect health, but apparently, from what we could tell, had some sort of a minor stroke. Yeah. And, as I like to jokingly say along with his friends, he was definitely in stroke denial. And by the time, it progressed and got worse, it was almost too late by the time he went to the doctor, and there was not a whole lot they could do. And then he just, ended up passing away a couple of weeks later from complications from that stroke.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. But that was the beginning, which you were talking about before, of a 20-year performing relationship that was so special for the both of you. And I could tell from just the couple days I got to spend with you guys out in California. What's your favorite memory?
Oh, gosh, my favorite memory with him, I'm going to share two of them with you. So Please. One personal memory and one working memory. So the professional memory was we had been, performing together probably 6 or maybe 7 years. And he was sharing with me his bucket list of things that he wanted to do. And one of the things that he wanted to do was for he and his partner to fly to Europe and take the Orient Express. And what a lot of people don't know is Rene was a huge train fanatic. And he had a garden railway at his home and small scale trains. He just loved trains and always wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. And then also he wanted to take the Concorde, which, at the time was flying. But the problem was that he didn't have a partner at the time. His former partner was no longer alive. He didn't have anyone new. And he wanted to do this on his 70th birthday, and it didn't happen. So by the time his 71st birthday came around, he goes, I really want to do this, but I don't want to go by myself. And I'm like, well, I don't think you should go by yourself either. And he turned and he goes, would you go with me? And I'm like, really? He goes, yeah. He goes, I love spending time with you. I think we would have a blast. And so off we went, and we flew to Rome and hopped on the Orient Express and spent a few days together on that, and through Italy, and ended up back in London, spent a few days there, and then we flew on the Concorde from London to New York.
Wow.
And that's one of my fondest memories. We had such a blast on that trip, and so many, many fond memories. We talked about it right up until, before he passed away. But I think
beautiful.
Oh yeah, it was just fantastic time. And probably my fondest memory of working with him, we always used to say that we were cut from the same cloth, but we knew that we had a pretty big age difference between us. So the running joke was that we were cut from the same piece of cloth. It's just they found the bolt of fabric about 30 years later when they cut another piece out for me. And so when we performed, it was inevitable that one of us was going to either forget something or mess something up. So my fondest memories are performing with him on stage at the same time. And people would always say, you guys always look like you're having such a fun time. And sometimes we see you chuckle or laugh. And I said, yep, that's because one of us would miss a step in the choreography and the other one out of the corner of their mouth would say, that's it, you're fired. And we would start laughing. We would fire each other repeatedly throughout these performances.
That's great.
And our running joke was that together we make one brain.
Oh, wow.
So it's one of my fondest memories of him.
That's
always laughing about something.
Yeah, and that leads into this game I like to play with some of our guests now. Best, worst, and biggest. The best moment on stage.
Oh, gosh. There were many best moments, but, I think, this is going to, maybe sound weird. I don't know. But I think one of the best moments on stage for Rene was when he performed at CAX in 2014.
Wow.
Because by that point in his life, a lot of people didn't know really who Rene was. He was very, very famous throughout the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. But by the 80s, he was not doing as much film and television work. He didn't have a television series anymore. So a lot of people didn't know who he was. And when we made arrangements to come up and perform at CAC, and just people were all over him and had him up on this pedestal. And I think he, for the first time in many, many years, realized that there are people out there that still worship him, and that there's a whole new bunch of people that now appreciate him for the artist that he is. And in his last month, he talked about CAX, and he knew he was going to be going back in 2015, and it was going to be a night with Rene, and that's all he wanted to do was talk about that and plan it out, because it just so reinvigorated him. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's the biggest. And then what were the other two?
Oh, I don't even want to go. I don't even want to do the rest of it now, because that's so touching, because I was there, and I got to tell you that we were in the shop. I don't know. Were you there, or was it just his partner at the time? Were you at the shop with Steve as well?
No, I wasn't there at the time.
Okay. We're at the shop with Steve, and we're sitting there in the room with the filming equipment, with the big tree and everything, and Renee's sitting on a stool, and Steve Axtell hands me his cell phone, and he goes, "Just take pictures." He says, "Because this is an unbelievable moment for me." And Mr. Axtell, if I'm spilling a personal moment, I'm sorry, but just to tell you, Joe, I mean that man touched so many lives and continues to this day.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think that's what I meant by just totally reinvigorating him, because, as any legend in the entertainment industry knows, that the longer you go without anything out there to remind people who you are, the more you begin to fade from people's memory. And plus, there's a whole new generation of, people in this, world we call performing, and that are puppeteers and are ventriloquists and clowns and jugglers and balloon artists. And, so many of them really are not aware of a lot of the history of their art. And so it was so wonderful to be able to bring Rene and introduce him to a whole new group of people, and, to have them look up to him the way he was looked up to many years earlier.
And so that is a great transition into the last, again, a dual-part question for you.
Gotcha.
How do you hope Rene is remembered, and how would Rene hope Rene is remembered?
Well, I hope that he's remembered for his mastery of the art, and also for all of the contributions that he made to the art of puppetry and the art of ventriloquism.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, Rene was not a ventriloquist. He had no desire to be a ventriloquist, but he did make ventriloquist figures for a number of people, and mostly because of his artistry at building marionettes. A lot of people, don't realize, but there was a point where, Rene started experimenting with building both his marionette characters and also his ventriloquist figures out of neoprene, which was something that was unheard of in the industry. So I hope that he's remembered by being an innovator, by being a great artist, and also by being a great performer, because he was such a wonderful person. And, it's just a shame that more people didn't have the pleasure of getting to know him throughout his lifetime.
Really is, yeah.
And as far as, how does he hope he's remembered? He loved to perform. And, I think back to something that Rene used to say time and time again. He always used to say, I love what I'm doing, and I do it because I love it. I've thoroughly enjoyed my life, and if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing.
That is fantastic. Joe Selph, thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing your story with Rene. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again to Joe. It was wonderful to talk to you. And I know I didn't say a lot in the beginning in terms of introducing who you are and who Rene was, but this was just one of those interviews that had to stand by itself, and I hope you listeners really got something out of it. It was really wonderful to hear your story, Joe, so thank you again. And thank you also for sharing Rene's mastery with everyone. Now, just to let you guys, you listeners know, Joe Selph is keeping Rene and his artist productions going. Visit renesmarionettes.com. That is RenesMarionettes.com. Now, before we close it up this week, I wanted to give a shout out to Paul Golio and his character Tinsel Garland for achieving the Record Holders Republic world record for saying the alphabet the quickest and clearest with no lip movement. Paul used ventriloquism to say the alphabet in under 3 seconds. 3 seconds, and I'm sure Tinsel's jaw hurt after that. So, Paul, congratulations. I always love to hear when everyone does some fantastic stuff in ventriloquism to get it out there. Record Holders Republic world record. Congratulations, my friend. That's it for us this week. Next week, Steve Hewlett, finalist from Britain's Got Talent, closes out this season of episodes. Can you believe it? We're already there. Plus, I'll have a preview of what you can expect when we return in June. Ventriloquism Weekly's season finale next week right here on your favorite platform to listen. And they include ventriloquismweekly.com. That is our mothership. You can access all our social media by going to our website, or you can go to ventriloquismweekly@gmail.com, or don't go there. Email into ventriloquismweekly@gmail.com, and find our page on Facebook at facebook.com/talkfor2. Tweet at us and tweet about us at or hashtag TALKFORTWO. From New York, signing off for Ventriloquism Weekly, I'm Matt Bailey, reminding all you vents out there to keep talking for two.